Hello, welcome to another class with Professor Choi. Today we are here to talk about the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. The aggregate supply, aggregate demand model is basically a model that explains short-run fluctuations in real GDP and prices. The aggregate demand is basically a curve that shows a relationship between price and real GDP, while the aggregate supply is a curve that shows the relationship between the short-run price level and real GDP supplied by companies. Let me show you real quick how the model looks. So the model is graphical, just like most other models. We have a line, which we're going to call aggregate supply. We have our line for aggregate demand. So on this side we have our price level. On this side we have our real GDP. On this side we have our short run aggregate supply. And on this side we have our aggregate demand. Now this model has a third line. This is the long run aggregate supply. Now the two short run lines are going to determine equilibrium prices in the short run, which we're going to call P star. And they're going to determine also real GDP in the short run, which again we're going to call real GDP star. Now the long run line determines real GDP, but in a sort of potential future. And this real GDP has to do with the sort of natural level of the economy. So this is associated with things like full employment in the economy. So again, associated with things like full employment. All right, so why is it that the aggregate demand is downward sloping? Well, there are three basic reasons why it's downward sloping, and these are basically three different effects that show a negative relationship between price and real GDP. One's called the wealth effect, the other one's called the interest rate effect, and the third one is called the international trade effect. So basically these three effects show you that the shape of the aggregate demand is downward sloping. Right, so again we got our price, we have our real GDP, and this is our aggregate demand. Now the three effects that are described in that particular slide, what they're basically showing you is how do we draw this negative relationship in aggregate demand. So it's the same as basically saying, imagine that I'm sort of here in point 1, and then I want to go to this point, let's call it point 2. Then basically as prices decline, real GDP tends to increase. So as our prices decline, our real GDP tends to increase, and that's basically what those three effects are showing you. Also, the opposite of this is also true. So if our prices were to increase, then our real GDP would basically decline, and that's what the aggregate demand shape basically shows, the negative relationship between those two. Now, if you look at the variables for aggregate demand, and in basically economic models, the variables are things that create a shift on the line, then things outside of prices and real GDP are the things that create shifts, like autonomous consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Now, the variables are things that make the line shift right or left. Now remember, a shift is basically a movement of the entire line. So let me take my model out of here. Alright, so again, a shift is something that makes a line moved right or left. Now, shifts happen due to a change in variables, change in a variable. So if this is my, let's call it aggregate demand 1, an example of a shift will be something like an increase in the level of consumption activity. So if we have an increase in autonomous consumption activity, then basically my aggregate demand line will shift to the right. Now again, a shift is a movement of the entire line. Oh, that didn't work. There we go. So a shift is a movement of the entire line. And if you have an increase in the level of consumption activity, then the aggregate demand will shift to the right. The opposite of this is also true. If you have a decline in consumption activity, then you'll see a decrease or a shift to the left in the aggregate demand line. Alright, so what are the variables that create shifts? So an example of a variable that creates a shift is government changes in their fiscal policy. Now, fiscal policy is basically when the government decides to change taxation or government spending in general. So if there's an increase in government spending, aggregate demand will shift to the right. If there's a decrease in government spending, then the aggregate demand will shift to the left. An increase in the level of taxes decreases the level of consumption, which makes the aggregate demand shift to the left. And a decrease in the level of taxes increases the level of consumption, makes the aggregate demand shift to the right. Another thing that will change the economy is the behavior of monetary policy. Now, monetary policy basically will be explained in the subsequent chapters, but in a very general way, the Federal Reserve can control the level of interest rates by changing the supply of money. So interest rates, though, are related to the economy because when you change the level of interest rates, it makes it relatively more or less expensive to purchase something like a house or a new car, and therefore it creates an increase or a decrease in the likelihood that people will be willing to do so. So in a very general way, when the Federal Reserve changes the level of interest rates, it affects economic activity because it makes companies more or less likely to invest, and it makes consumers more or less likely to buy, not to mention foreigners. So the relationship between and let's use lowercase I as interest rates. So every time, for example, there's a decrease in the level of interest rates, one of the things that you're going to notice is that there's going to be a general increase in the level of consumption, an increase in the level of investment, and an increase in net exports due to a depreciation of the currency. The opposite is also true. If the interest rates increase, then you're going to see a general decrease in the level of consumption, or a slowdown. You'll see a decrease in the level of investment, and you'll see a decrease in the level of net exports. So basically, by manipulating interest rates, the Federal Reserve can create actual changes in economic activity, which will create shifts on the aggregate demand. So that's what we call monetary policy. All right, another part that can change the economy is households and firms as we change our purchasing behavior. Expectations in the level of income, for example, we're going to be using letter Y for income. So expected income, also known as YE here. If you expect income to increase, then the aggregate demand tends to shift to the right. If you expect income to decrease, then the aggregate demand will shift to the left. This is one of the reasons why recessions are created, is because people, as they notice that economic activity is in decline, or they feel like they might lose their job, then they expect income to decline, and as a consequence of that, make the aggregate demand shift to the left by basically saving money and consuming less. Investment profitability, if you have a change in investment profitability to the increase, so if companies think they're going to be making more money, then investment tends to increase and the aggregate demand tends to shift to the right. If you expect investment profitability to decline, then you'll see a decrease in the level of investment and the aggregate demand will shift to the left. Outside variables can also affect economic activity. If US GDP is increasing faster than the foreigner's GDP, then basically your income in the US is increasing faster than the foreigners. Therefore, we import more, export less. Net exports tends to fall, and the aggregate demand will shift to the left. The opposite of that is also true. If the US currency becomes stronger or it appreciates, then it tends to decrease the level of exports. Imports tend to increase. Net exports tends to decrease, and the aggregate demand will shift to the left. If you see a depreciation of the US dollar, then that creates an opposite effect, where exports tend to increase, imports tends to fall, net exports tends to increase, and the aggregate demand will shift to the right. Now for our aggregate supply, the long-run aggregate supply line basically shows you the relationship between the long-run price level and real GDP. Now the long-run line is purely theoretical in the sense that it's always sort of a stick in the future, but it is very much real in the sense that the predictions that this model makes tend to come true. It also explains what would happen if you decide to do one change in the aggregate demand and then let the rest be. In other words, if you create one change and then sort of fast forward into the future. We'll do some examples of this at the end. The short-run aggregate supply is upward sloping for three basic reasons. Contracts makes wages and prices sticky. Firms are slow to adjust wages, and we have manual costs. Now, to understand this right here, let's go back and talk about what is the difference between short run and long run. Now, in this particular model, we're going to be using sort of two time periods. The assumption is that you're always in the short run. So we're always going to be in the short run. And then you only go into the long run if you're told we're in the long run. Now, in the short run, in a basic way, there is no relationship between prices and wages. So when prices go up, wages don't have to follow in any particular direction. They could go up, but they could go down, or they could basically stay the same. And that's the situation basically in the short run. So prices can go down, and then there'll be no real relationship between prices and wages. And again, we have seen this in the real world, where some people may be experiencing inflation, but their wages are not changing up or down. The long run is a very particular thing that we tend to notice in general over long run time periods. So this particular behavior is a direct relationship between prices and wages. So every time you see prices going up in the short run, what we tend to see in the long run is that wages will follow by going up. Now, if this is true, we're going to have a situation of what we call a wage push in the long run. And then in the long run, the short run aggregate supply will shift to the left because of that wage push. And that creates an economic cycle. And we'll talk about that towards the end. Now, if the opposite is true, if prices are declining in the short run, then what's going to happen once you go into the long run is that wages will follow in the same direction, and then your short run aggregate supply will shift to the right. Right? So basically, again, in the short run, you have prices not directly related with wages. And in the long run, you have a direct relationship between prices and wages. Now, what keeps prices from changing in the short run is, one, we have contracts for wages and for prices. I don't know if you notice, for example, every time you go to work, you make the assumption of receiving the same wage. So that fixes wages over short periods of time. If few employers are going to give you a changing wage every day, they'll give you a changing wage maybe once every 6 months or maybe once every year, if they do. Firms are generally slow to adjust wages, and we also have a sort of menu pricing in our economy where everybody's sort of used to seeing a particular price level or a menu. And because companies have to be transparent about prices, they don't tend to change them too quickly unless necessary. All right, now let's talk about what are some of the things that create shifts in the aggregate supply. Now, again, a shift in the aggregate supply is when the line moves to the right or to the left. So let's do a shift in aggregate supply. All right, so let's execute a shift in aggregate supply. Now, an example of something that could create a shift in aggregate supply, for example, is a change in technology. So if there's an increasing technological activity, in the sense that we discover some brand new technology that makes us more efficient, so an increase in technology will make the aggregate supply or short-run aggregate supply shifts to the right. So we will have to draw a second aggregate supply to the right of the previous one, and we'll go from aggregate supply 1 to aggregate supply 2. And again, that's a shift or an increase in the short-run aggregate supply. A decrease in the short-run aggregate supply is the opposite of this. So imagine that we have a decrease in the level of technology. Then what would happen is my short-run aggregate supply will shift to the left. All right, so let's go over that list of shifts. The changes in the labor force and capital stock can change the aggregate supply. Increase in the labor force or in capital stock will shift the aggregate short-run aggregate supply to the right. A decrease in those will make a shift to the left. Increasing the level of technology makes you more efficient, so increases productivity and the short-run aggregate supply shift to the right. A decrease in technology will make it shift to the left. Expectations about changes. So if you have an increase in wages, for example, then the short-run aggregate supply will shift to the left. A decrease in wages will make the short-run aggregate supply shift to the right. An adjustment into an underestimated price level. So if there's an increase in a price level that was underestimated, then it will make the short-run aggregate supply shift to the left and the price level will move up. If you have a decrease in an adjustment to an overestimated price level, then prices tend to decrease and the short-run aggregate supply will shift to the right. Now, things outside of our control or unexpected changes in prices and the cost of production, for example, will also create a movement in the aggregate supply. Something we call a supply shock. Now, supply shock can come from several sort of outside forces, albeit, for example, the weather, what's happening in the recession of 2020, basically a change in the behavior of people and workers with the COVID-19. Another thing that could create it is a rapid change in prices, like for example, a change in the price of oil. Now, increase in the price of resources or what we call a negative supply shock will make the short-run aggregate supply shift to the left, and a decrease in the price of resources or a potential positive supply shock will make the short-run aggregate supply shift to the right. All right, so again, let's practice some of these changes. Now let's sort of understand a full cycle here. So let's go long run, short run in the same sort of graph, and we'll see if that works. So I don't think the color matters. All right, so we'll put our labels here. We've got our price level. We have our real GDP. All right, so again, what we're going to do here is we're going to have a sort of short run move on this graph. And then in this graph, we're going to do that same short run move and then take it into the long run. Now remember, the way this sort of shows up on exams is you have a sort of short run move and then they might just leave it there. While if you have a long run move, then it's a follow up from something that happened in the short run. So on this one here, we're gonna we'll use blue for that, and then we'll use okay, let's get rid of this. Okay, then let's okay, yep, and then let's use We need for that. Yes. All right. So again, we have our short run aggregate supply. We have our aggregate demand, and we have our sort of current equilibrium level. So let's call it a P1 and real GDP 1. Alright, so let's create a change in the short run. Now let's say that there is a increase in the level of consumption in the short run. Actually, no, let's do policy, since we're going to be doing this in follow-up chapter. So let's say there's an increase in the level of government spending. Now, if you go back to the list of determinants, an increase in the level of government spending creates a shift to the right in the aggregate demand. So what's going to happen in our graph up here is we're going to go from aggregate demand 1, and we're going to have to draw to the right of that, and aggregate demand 2. Alright, now as we are moving from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2, we're going to be sort of sliding upwards through the short run aggregate supply line. And the economy in the short run starts experiencing inflation, which is what an increase in price is. So we go from P1 to P2. And we start experiencing increases in real GDP. So we go from real GDP 1 to real GDP 2. So in the short run, the aggregate demand shifting to the right. So as the aggregate demand shifts to the right, we're going to notice that prices are going to go up in the economy, and real GDP is going to be increasing. So we can say something like an increase in the level of government spending is going to make real GDP move to the right. Now, another thing that makes real GDP move to the right, or create a sort of similar effect to this, is a decrease in the level of tax collection by the government, or what people call a tax cut. So a decrease in the level of taxes, we're using the letter T for taxes here, creates a very similar effect as what you see up here. All right. Now let's try to sort of take this effect and go into the long run period and see what happens. Now the long run period picks up very much where we have this aggregate demand already sort of shifted to the right. So now our aggregate demand is to the right of the previous one. So we have gone up here into this sort of new equilibrium level. So here we are. Aggregate demand 1 has now moved to aggregate demand 2. As a consequence of that, we have moved from equilibrium level 1 to equilibrium level 2. Now, this is only in the short run. The long run line does not move. And I'll explain a little bit why does that, how will that move. Now, this long run line represents a sort of natural level of economic activity, or a sort of full employment level in the economy. So when this happens in this particular shift, we're making the assumption that we're already at full employment here, and then you move the aggregate demand to the right, and then you create this particular change. Now, if this is true, then in the long run period, when prices go up, we're going to experience an increase in the level of wages. So we'll see wages go up. Now, when wages go up, that's going to create a cost push to the left. So the short run aggregate supply will shift to the left because we're going to have a sort of wage push. Wages basically increase the cost of production because every worker becomes more expensive. And as a consequence of that, that wage push or income, that increase in the cost of production makes the short run aggregate supply shift to the left. So we will have to then shift our short run aggregate supply to the left. And well, that one didn't look as good, did it? So as we shift our short run aggregate supply to the left, we move along this line now when that line shifts, and we end up in this sort of new long run equilibrium. Now notice that as we are moving in the long run upwards here, you're going to see a slowdown in economic activity. So your economy is going to experience an expansion followed by a recession in the long run. And then the result on GDP, it's basically null. So you go from 1 to 2, and then right after that back to 3. And this is how this model creates a sort of business cycle. So you see an expansion being created by economic activity, followed by a recession being created by the cost excess of that economic activity. Now notice that the end result is a farther increase in the level of inflation. So we go from the original price 1 to price 2. And that's the sort of long run end result of this policy, assuming you don't change anything else in the economy. All right, now let's have a conversation about what happens when we do make other changes in the economy, not just this here. All right, now, believe it or not, we have medicine for recessions. We don't have medicine for what we call stagflation. Stagflation is what seems to be happening again in the recession of 2020 due to COVID-19. And we'll talk about that because it seems to be not only a supply shock, but also a demand shock. Now let's talk about both of these. All right, so let me set up my model here. Okay, let me label my axis. That's my short run aggregate supply. This is my aggregate demand. My short run aggregate supply and my aggregate demand. All right, so first let's talk about a situation of stagflation. Now, stagflation can happen due to a negative supply shock. So let's say that the price of oil rises very quickly. Now, if the price of oil rises very quickly, transportation costs will rise very fast, because oil is what we use in order to create gasoline, and lots of things run on gasoline, not to mention oil is what we use to create lots and lots of plastics, and basically anything made out of plastic will have to go up in price. So an increase in the price of oil can create a stagflation situation where your short-run aggregate supply will shift to the left. Now, when your short-run aggregate supply shifts to the left, you end up with two sort of negative effects in the economy. So we'll have our short-run aggregate supply so as our short-run aggregate supply is shifting to the left, notice that we would be moving along the aggregate demand towards this sort of higher level of prices, and then your economy will be experiencing at the same time a recession. So real GDP will go from this situation of real GDP 1 to this real GDP 2, and a decrease in real GDP is a recession. So an increase in the price of oil can create rapidly a decrease in the short-run aggregate supply, which ends in an increase in the level of prices and a decrease in the level of real GDP. Now, this situation is what is called stagflation. So stagflation is an increase in prices together with a decrease in real GDP. Now, another thing that can create stagflation is what's happening in 2020, where we have the scare from COVID-19, and companies are having to adjust their production behavior to the new reality. And as a consequence of that, many of them are unable to produce or are forced to cut their production, which makes the short-run aggregate supply shift to the left. And as a consequence of that, you see an inflationary pressure in lots and lots of items. The most obvious is anything that has to do with protection associated with COVID-19, face masks, for example, medical equipment in general, protective gear for medical equipment, and lots of products that are being produced by the companies that are affected would go up in price, and it will also create a slowdown in economic activity. And again, this is what we call a negative supply shock. All right, now let's start to talk about a sort of nice picture of how to grow your economy over long periods of time. Now, if you want to grow over long periods of time, well, that line didn't work very well, did it? Okay, see if we can make a better one. All right, that one worked beautifully. All right, so let's talk about how to grow your economy steadily over long periods of time. So to create sustainable economic growth, the idea is that you have to be able to shift both the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply to the right, so that you don't create this effect here where you end up with high inflation and a sort of move back or push back in economic activity. Now, in order to be able to create that, what we need to do is we need to move to the right both the short-run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand. So let's come up with a sort of hypothetical situation where that happens. So we would have to say, make my my economy have a technological advance. So let's say that there's an increase in technology, and then let's say that at the same time there is a steady increase in consumption. Now, this increase in technology is going to make my short-run aggregate supply shift to the right. So we'll go from short-run aggregate supply 1 to short-run aggregate supply 2. And then this increase in consumption, so my short-run aggregate supply will shift to the right. Now, this increase in consumption is going to make my aggregate demand shift to the right. So we'll go from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2. Now, as that occurs, notice that in a basic way, we're going to be moving from this equilibrium to this equilibrium. Now, we could follow this sort of path, or we could follow this sort of path to get there. And I want you to think about this sort of happening in a sort of at the same time. So you're going to see a sort of increase in aggregate demand together with an increase in the short-run aggregate supply. So you'll be following this sort of pattern as you're getting to this new point if you were to draw these sort of subsequent lines to the right. Now, as you're moving these two at the same time, prices never tend to rise too quickly, which does not allow wages to rise too fast, and it doesn't create this sort of pullback of economic activity too quickly. So slowly but surely, your economy just sort of trickles along with very low levels of inflation, and what you experience is long-run economic growth, where your long-run line will follow, and we end up moving towards our new potential level of economic activity from our previous level of economic activity. So this is how you create long-run growth. It's a sort of partnership in many ways between the short run, the producers on this side, and the consumers on this side, in a very basic way. All right, and that pretty much wraps it up for this particular chapter. I hope you have enjoyed it, and have a good time.